some things that voters do know about her is her very liberal policies that she had during her 2020 presidential campaign, and then in some of her Senate career. And I thought it was interesting too, because she said something about immigration, and one of the points that she made was that, we're going to people that aren't here illegally, we're going to sort of deport them really quickly, which I thought was just sort of putting the full stop on this, or period on this way of how immigration policy has changed for the Democratic Party.
Right.
So even though it was sort of a very much a stump speech and things that we've heard her say before in terms of Trump coming into the White House with a enemies list versus her to-do list, there were some really interesting tidbits that came out of it.
Welcome to Reporter's Notebook, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories breaking on their beats. I'm Jim Antle, and I'm joined today by White House reporter Naomi Lim. Naomi, Vice President Harris is making her closing argument, or I guess she's made it. Give us a little bit of an insight into what she's honing in on in the final stretch here.
Well, what was really interesting, so she organized this closing argument speech on the Ellipse, which of course was meant to create a contrast with the last time there was a big political speech at the Ellipse, which was the January 6th sort of Stop the Steal rally,
Right.
Hosted by former President Donald Trump before some of his supporters, ransacked the Capitol to stop the certification of the 2020 Electoral College. So obviously that was setting it up to be a lot about her versus Trump. She did probably maybe her harshest rebukes of him yet, calling him a petty tyrant, which I thought was notable because part of this appeal was also to undecided voters, potentially Republicans who may have voted for Trump in the past and maybe don't like his personality and may be considering voting for Harris. And so for her to go so hard after Trump was a way to sort of to reach them, but not really live the bipartisanship that she talks about. The other thing that I thought was striking is that, it just really crystallized the shortness of this campaign, because a closing arguments address, she was still sort of saying, I know some of you don't know me, and she had to sort of say, and it was also interesting too, because she kind of painted herself as this political outsider, saying she hasn't spent half her her political career or half her career in Washington, which I thought was that was probably the first time I've heard her say something like that. But then also maybe some things that voters do know about her is her very liberal policies that she had during her 2020 presidential campaign, and then in some of her Senate career. And I thought it was interesting too, because she said something about immigration, and one of the points that she made was that, we're going to people that aren't here illegally, we're going to sort of deport them really quickly, which I thought was just sort of putting the full stop on this, or period on this way of how immigration policy has changed for the Democratic Party.
Right.
So even though it was sort of a very much a stump speech and things that we've heard her say before in terms of Trump coming into the White House with a enemies list versus her to-do list, there were some really interesting tidbits that came out of it.
So as you mentioned, that there is an element of Harris introducing herself, or at least reintroducing herself to the general public, and there's an element of her pivoting to the center. But it does seem that her overall pitch is to try to make this election a referendum on Trump.
Exactly, and I mean, this is always where, again, and it's also interesting about this candidacy, her trying to be this change candidate, at the same time being sort of part of the incumbent administration, and that's something that she's had to struggle with this whole cycle. She has gotten stronger when asked about, what would she do different from Biden. The first time she was asked that question on The View, she sort of said, oh, nothing, and then sort of said she would appoint a Republican to her cabinet. It's sort of again evolved. This time she was sort of saying, I bring different life experiences and things like that to the Oval Office. And she sort of said that her number one priority, when she and President Joe Biden came into office, their number one priority was dealing with the pandemic. And she said, the priority that I would have moving forward would be to lower costs, lower prices. So that was something that she tried to say. But again, I think that just knowing where the Biden administration sits with its approval ratings, Biden's approval, it increased, it improved just after he sort of announced that he was dropping out. But in the sort of the 3 months since, they're sort of softened again. And so I think they're just really struggling with this idea that people want change, and whether that change is in the form of someone that was president before but is no longer president right now, is something that they're going to have to decide. But I do feel like they think that they can win if it's a referendum on Trump as opposed to a referendum on themselves.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned Biden, and there was some thought that when Harris was struggling to nail down some of these private sector union endorsements, that maybe Democrats would have buyer's remorse about making the switch. But I think in the closing days, some things have transpired that make it really clear that not really.
No, it's exactly right, because I think we thought that Harris, we sort of knew that she would be a little bit softer in terms of that union, that older white vote, and someone like Biden would actually speak to more sort of consistent voters, such as senior voters, as opposed to younger voters. But what we're seeing is the things that created anxiety about Democrats moving, like when he did his first debate, things that sort of brought up his age and mental acuity, that came up again this week, and there was sort of two sort of notable examples. The first one happened in New Hampshire, where he sort of said, into encouraging Democrats, staffers that are working up in that state, that that we need to politically lock Trump up, which obviously, taken out of context, could be highly charged in terms of persecution, things like that.
It's also a split infinitive.
Oh yeah, we can't have that now. And then we also had most recently this idea of him being on a call, just a very low stakes call to try and excite Latino grassroots organizers. And he mentioned comments that were made at Trump's Madison Square Garden rally, where one of the comedians sort of referenced Puerto Rico being a floating island of garbage. Biden says that he said that the comedian was garbage, but depending on where you put an apostrophe, it could have been taken to mean all of Trump's supporters are garbage, and people have likened this to Hillary Clinton's basket of deplorables. A small part of me thinks that calling someone garbage is different from fascist and things like that. I think there's a sliding scale that's going on here. But when you are a party that sort of your whole sort of argument is about civility and things like that, it hits a little bit differently. There have been other things too where he's stepped on the vice president, coming into the White House press briefing room when she was supposed to do a keynote address elsewhere on the campaign trail. So he's just creating problems. And on top of his record as well, and just talking to Democratic strategists, I asked them, are there any regrets? And one of them said, no regrets.
Just taking out the trash, Jack.
Exactly.
Thank you, Naomi. You can read Naomi and the rest of our political team's coverage at washingtonexaminer.com.